Welcome into episode 215 of the Skate Podcast. I'm Brian DeFelice, joined by Bridget Prue and Scott McLaughlin. Bridget and Scott, the off-season of misery for the Boston Bruins and their fans continues. Another one bites the dust. David Krejci has retired from the National Hockey League and is no longer a Boston Bruin officially. We knew this was coming, but it's just the off-season starts in April with a very, very, very disappointing playoff exit. And then Bergeron retires a few months later. And then a few weeks later, David Krejci retires. And what's the pulse of the two of you? What's the pulse of the Bruins fan base this summer?
You know, it's weird because it's been such a slow burn that it feels like, we've already had all these conversations about like, okay, what do they do if Bergeron and Krejci are gone? And it's like, well, there's so much time, I think we've all talked about that, for months. And honestly, even last off season when we didn't yet know their decisions. So, it's not, I feel the same way like I did when Bergeron retired, where it's like, there's not a surprise here. It's not like, Krejci, the Bruins released Krejci's statement Monday morning. And I don't think anyone was like, oh my God, I can't believe Krejci retired. Like everyone kind of knew it was coming. But, it's still, it's still pretty, it's a bummer, right? Because it is the end of an era. And, seeing them both now actually officially retire really kind of hammers it home where it's like, especially with Bergeron, until we got that announcement, there was at least a chance he was coming back. That's one where I think all of us like legitimately didn't know for sure. Maybe you leaned one way one week, another way another time, or whatever. Krejci, I think we all expected to be gone. So less surprise, less sort of, I guess it doesn't quite hit as hard because we weren't ever really planning for the possibility that he might be back. Whereas with Bergeron, I think the week before we had done an episode of here's how they look with him, here's how they look without him. Like it was, it was still very much on the table. So yeah, you do some reflection on their obviously incredible careers and this whole era, and then you can't help but now look forward and look at okay, what's there, what's next, both at sort of like the micro at the center position, what's next with those two gone, but then even bigger picture of like what does this next year look like, what does this next era look like, who steps up and takes over as leaders and all that stuff.
And I also feel like it wasn't shocking because Krejci has done this before. This isn't the first offseason where we got news that Krejci wasn't going to be playing for the Bruins. I think it was more surprising when we found out last offseason he was coming back. And I feel like the very first time around that Krejci decided he didn't want to play in the NHL and went back to play in the Czech Republic was when I felt really old because when I first really was getting into the Bruins, Krejci was my first favorite player. So when he stepped away from the NHL the first time, I was like, what happened? I feel so old. And now this summer, whether you're, me and Brian's age or you're older, you're feeling your age a little bit.
You can say it, Bridget. Scott's age.
Thanks for not saying
I'm not saying our age. I'm not.
Getting older like Scott. When you get older like Scott.
When you're Scott's age and you remember, way back. But no, it makes you feel old. And I think that, like, makes you reflect on, like, what the hell happened to the last, I'd say, 15 years since, like, or even before that, since when Krejci and Bergeron started. It doesn't feel that long ago, but now we're sitting around going, okay, well, that is the end of an era for sure. And like you said, Scott, what's to come in the new era? Even Krejci did touch on it a little bit. He was asked, Bergeron wasn't really asked about the next group of leadership, but Krejci was. And I mean, he brought up Charlie McAvoy a lot. He brought up David Pastrnak a lot. Charlie Coyle, he mentioned as a leader. So I think that they have guys that have been able to learn around guys like Bergeron and Krejci and Chara for a long time. And even, some of the younger goalies like Swayman played a year with Tuukka. There's been at least that transition period where some of the younger guys kind of get what the whole Bruins culture is about, and they seem to be, they have the right characters. I think, I don't think they're lacking that next level, the next generation of leadership. I think they already have it.
So that's something that Krejci was asked about during his media availability. The two of you were on the Zoom call. There was a quote that stuck out to me that I saw. Scott, was there a quote in particular from the media availability that stood out to you, and just some general updates, some laundry keeping from that availability that maybe listeners would like to hear from as well?
Yeah, I don't know if there was like one specific quote that stuck out. I think overall, I came away feeling the same way I did when we talked to Bergeron, which is like he's content with his decision and clearly knew it was time. He, on multiple occasions, cited his health. He mentioned that this past season was hard on him and his family because his family came up a few times throughout the year, but mostly spent the year down at their home in South Carolina. So, he wasn't with them a lot. And Krejci, by the way, was in South Carolina now. That's where he usually goes every summer anyways, and is, where he did his Zoom with us from. But yeah, he said that he kind of knew when he started getting injuries late in the season. And, we know he missed time in the playoffs, but let's not forget he also missed quite a bit of time down the stretch. I think it was about 12 games over the last, month or so of the season that he missed. He said he kind of knew.
Time, we kind of chalked that up to rest.
Right. But we thought they were just playing it super, super safe. And it turns out he was actually hurt, and it lingered into the playoffs and forced him to miss games there as well. So he said he kind of had a good idea once the injuries kind of got to him, that it was time. And he even said, he knows his body can't handle 82 games anymore. He didn't totally close the door on potentially playing for Czechia in the World Championships in the spring because they're in Prague, and that's something that would mean a lot to him. But he said, he probably won't make any decision along those lines until Christmas time. And then he would have to, play a little bit somewhere in Europe in the second half of the season and then get ready for that. So, so that's kind of what stood out to me, is just that he clearly knew it was time. He, almost felt like there really wasn't another option. Like health-wise, he just, he knew his body was telling him that's it. He didn't quite hold up through an entire game this season, and he doesn't think he would have been able to hold up next year either.
Yeah, I think we got some answers to some of the questions. Once again, he was actually more straightforward and clear about how his health factored into him making this decision. And he said that it kind of just makes me think how catastrophic it was that last few weeks of the regular season that led to Bergeron and Krejci getting injuries, and kind of that setting into their mind, okay, I don't think my body can handle this anymore. Because maybe in an alternative universe, they don't get hurt. And first of all, you're better off in the first round. Playoffs probably go differently. But maybe they're also thinking, all right, I'm still good to go for another season. So you think back on those final weeks of the regular season, and you kind of know now that those were some really deciding days of these two guys deciding to retire. So one thing that Krejci mentioned, that Bergeron said he wouldn't have needed surgery to come back. Krejci said he would have. So we're not 100% sure what kind of surgery it would be, but he said he knows that basically, and I think because of needing the surgery is why he kept saying like his body wouldn't have been ready for a full NHL season, because I'm guessing it would have involved recovery time of missing some months in the season, having to rehab, get back into things, and him just not thinking his body could handle it, or at least not at the level that he would be able to help his team out as much as he would want to. So he said he had known from that injury that he was probably going to retire, but he didn't want to say because he didn't want to make an emotional decision, which is kind of something Bergeron said as well.
A quote that stood out to me was Krejci talking about Marc Savard and Patrice Bergeron and how impactful they were on Krejci in the beginning of his career in particular. And I was happy to hear him mention Savard because I just feel like Marc Savard's presence was a big. He was. I feel like he was a heavy influence on the Bruins turning into Stanley Cup champions in 2011. Although he wasn't on the ice much at all that entire season, but I mean, he was that era of Bruins hockey. Quite literally, like even the year they won the cup, had he been healthy, he would have been their number one center. Like he was their number one center. People forget, and it's understandable because like when you win a cup, sometimes you fall in love with the players that did it, and rightfully so. But the Bruins won that cup without their number one center going into that season, and that was Marc Savard. And while they did most of the year without him because of the lingering concussion issues from the year prior, he was a very integral part of that Bruins era from 07, honestly 06 to health permitting 2011. But I just feel like Marc Savard's name isn't mentioned as often as it should be and doesn't get the credit he deserves in that time because in 07, 08, Bergeron went down the whole year and Krejci hadn't yet really debuted. He had a couple games under his belt maybe, but Marc Savard alone was your center depth that year, and he willed them to a postseason with one center. Could you tell me who the Bruins' second center was before David Krejci emerged when Bergeron was hurt? It was probably Krejci. Probably got a shot pretty quickly, but it was just my point is he wasn't established, and Marc Savard was a big presence. So I was happy to hear Krejci mention Savard, and it makes me think about Pavel Zacha and Charlie Coyle and how they have had a chance to look at Bergeron and Krejci as well, because Krejci talked about how Savard and Bergeron didn't hold hands. They led by example, but made you sink or swim on your own ultimately at the end of the day. And so Charlie Coyle and Pavel Zacha, I'm sure, have learned under that same guidance. I guess the question is, and this isn't to divert from the Krejci conversation, but like does Zacha and does Coyle, do they have the skill set to be what the Bruins need them to be? Because it's still I understand the Bruins have been competing for cups for a long time, and that comes at the cost of trade deadline acquisitions and giving away draft collateral, and there's a cost to staying near the top. And because of that, the Bruins haven't had high draft picks, and there's a reason why the center ice position hasn't been easy to restock. But the Bruins still essentially waited for Bergeron and Krejci to retire before they were like, okay, now what do we do? So that, and I just find that, and I know like you're waiting on their decisions, but it's just, it's a little, I can't help but feel it's irresponsible. And you can sit there and say you owe the management owes it to the players to give them the time they need. Fine. But what you're left with now is you're going into a season where you're still trying to compete, and center ice is a glaring weakness for this team. There's not a ton of weakness outside of center ice, but center ice is the weakest position. So has the fabric that Bergeron, Krejci, and Savard before them, like, is that going to be installed in Coyle and Zacha, or are they just a little in over their heads as far as what they're being asked to do going into the next year, at least as it stands today?
Yeah, it's a good point. And, I would add Trent Frederick. I know he didn't play a ton of center, but he's been around long enough to pick up a lot from those guys. And we know he's picked up from Charlie Coyle because they've been on the same line, but like you hope he's picked up from those guys as well. Yeah, you're right. Like it's almost two different things, because it's like you can learn the work ethic and the culture and how to handle yourself as a professional day in, day out. And, at the very least, I certainly think Charlie Coyle has that. I think we see that all the time from him. But then having the skill set and like actually being able to go out and play that role on the ice is something else. Like you're right. It's possible that Charlie Coyle, just might not be good enough to produce the way you need a top two center to produce. It's possible that Pavel Zacha might not be ready after, certainly like a breakout season, but still just 1 year in Boston. So, they're going to find out they don't have any other options. So, we'll see. But yeah, I do think they took at least I do think they took a couple swings at like trying to build something towards the future when it comes to the center position, and maybe just missed or didn't quite work out. Like I think when they signed Coyle to that extension, and you look at the money he got, I think part of that was in their minds there was a projection that there was still more than he had shown. There's still more offense, and maybe he could be a number 2 center down the road. And now he's finally going to get a chance. But so far, I'd say what we've seen from Charlie Coyle is a really good number 3 center, but someone that you definitely have question marks as to whether he's just gonna produce enough offense to be a top 2 center. They used the first round pick on Johnny Beecher. He just never really developed offensively, and he might still have an NHL future, obviously, but it looks like it's more likely going to be on a 3rd or 4th line. So yeah, they've taken more swings recently, whether it's the Zaka trade or other draft picks like Quatra, Harrison, Spicer, Locke Mellis, all these centers they've drafted in recent years, signing Georgi Merkulov out of Ohio State. But those guys are all, at least a year, 2, 3 years away. We don't really know. Like their developing is still happening. So, yeah, obviously that they didn't get the timing right. Like it would be great if you had your next 2 number 2 centers ready to go, and they step right in when Bergeron and Krejci retire, but it doesn't always work that smoothly. You can't always have the Aaron Rodgers, Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers succession plan. Like it doesn't always go that smoothly in sports.
You just made me think nothing went smoother than the Tom Brady Cam Newton transition. I'll tell you
that. yeah, that was great for the Patriots.
That was such an epic transition, that one. Sorry, you made me lose my train of thought with
Hopefully none of these guys are Cam Newton. Hopefully they're at least a little better than that.
Yeah, no. But this is going to be the season where there's going to be some major growing pains, because you're needing for people to step up in such a big way in order for the season to, I don't even want to say go like last year. It's not going to go like last year, but to go in an acceptable direction where you can work with it, you can make the playoffs, and you actually a season that you can look back on next year and go, okay, well, we did see the growth that we wanted from some of these guys. Charlie Coyle, I think, is a really good leader. We haven't even talked about Brad Marchand, but as one of the leaders we have on past episodes, but it kind of feels like it's his turn to take over some of the responsibility of the leading by example. And
yeah, and it's worth noting that Krejci did mention Marchand right off the bat.
Yes, he did. So, we just haven't mentioned him
right.
Yeah, on this episode. We have previously. More likely than not, that's going to be who wears the next C for the Bruins. So if you're talking about the transition, you still have some guys there that, like Marchand, who's been there for a long time. And this is something else that Krejci brought up. As good of a player as Pastrnak and some of the young guys are, this next group of leadership hasn't won a Stanley Cup. So you're looking at the core that used to be there that had the Stanley Cup under their belt in 2011, and that is really gone away. And Marchand's still there, but the next group of guys are hungry for their own Stanley Cup. In particular, someone like David Pastrnak, who is, he's so good. He deserves one. I could say that the same thing about McDavid, that hasn't happened for him either. But the most optimistic thing that Krejci said in the whole press conference was that, that Pastrnak doesn't have the Stanley Cup yet, but he thinks that he'll do it in Boston. So he was still very optimistic about the Bruins' future.
Well, the Bruins' future is definitely optimistic on the back end and on the wing as long as Pastrnak is there and in goal. But, I guess if you're not going to have the next guys ready to go when Bergeron and Krejci retire, I get that. The timing is tough, especially when you're competing. I think what is going to be sorely missed in the development of players like Georgi Merkulov, should he be NHL bound one day, or Matthew Poitras, should he be NHL bound one day, is they're not going to have the ability to sit on a bench on a fourth line role or a third line role and watch Bergeron, how he plays the game 200 feet, and say, okay, this is how I have to play center ice. And he's got, so now any center that the Bruins have currently drafted or will draft in the future, they're going to have to kind of sink or swim on their own, and they're going to have to develop through great coaching. And who knows, maybe Bergeron comes back in a coaching capacity at some point, or just helps. You have no idea. Nobody really helped Bergeron. I mean, he was behind Joe Thornton for a couple of years before the Bruins traded him. I wouldn't say Bergeron modeled his game after Joe Thornton. They were kind of two different players completely. So Bergeron was able to. Bergeron, that was his DNA. It was his DNA to be the type of player that he was. So I guess the Bruins, I'm sure their scouting department is in search of players that might have that similar makeup like a Bergeron, to be self-motivated and have that self-drive. And maybe a player like Matthew Poitras is one of those. Who knows? I mean, he's probably the highest rated center ice prospect they have right now besides Merkulov. So that's why I'm mentioning those two names. I guess that's just a missed opportunity, because it's one thing for Charlie Coyle and Pavel Zacha to watch the Krejci and Bergeron. That's great. I mean, they're established NHL players. Like, they've, you know what I mean? Trent Frederick, sure. I don't think he has the ceiling of a number one center at all. Or number two center, really. So those players, it's great for them to have watched Bergeron and Krejci, but not having any of their recent draft picks have a chance to kind of watch them up close and personal, I think is a missed opportunity. The roster wasn't really open for anybody recently, so I get it. I'm just saying, in theory, it'd be nice if at one point, like if the Bruins, if they came back one more year, right? If Bergeron and Krejci came back for one more year for the 100th season, and in a perfect world, maybe a Merkulov sneaks into a lineup later in the season, who knows, or whatever. But as you guys have mentioned off the top, family and injuries really prevented these two players from coming back, and so it is what it is. You just would have liked to at least have some sliver of overlap to watch it up close in person.
Yeah, well, I do think on that same note, like, it's huge that Pavel Zacha at least got that, like he did at least get 1 year playing with them. And in the case of Krejci, literally playing with him on the same line. Think about how much worse this would be had they not made that trade last summer. And, then you're looking at a situation where you have another year of Eric Haula. He probably out the door as a free agent this summer. His contract was up. And then you're still looking for
Zacha's contract got renewed during the season. He technically at the time was going to be a free agent too.
Right. But like, imagine, you're looking for signing another center or trading for one or whatever. And we know what their cap situation was. So it's like, you're right. Like, it would have been great for some other guys to get that chance to, maybe have already moved into a third or fourth line role and play behind Bergeron and Krejci in the lineup. But on the optimistic side of that, at least Zacha did, and he's a huge part of this equation going forward.
Yeah, that was huge. Getting Zacha was huge. It turned out to be a much bigger move than it seemed like at the time. Because I mean, even coming in, it was kind of like, okay, this is a guy that we haven't followed him very closely. He's a winger, like they need centers, but you look back at where he was drafted and where he played growing up, and him being able to be that versatile winger and center helped them this past season. But in theory, he's signed for 4 more years. So he's part of that plan. And I'm happy it worked out for him. I mean, the organization as well, they were taking a risk. They didn't know. He hadn't had any super impressive seasons. He had struggled in New Jersey for lacking that right fit. But it was kind of if you remember the first few months of the season before he got the extension, it was kind of like a prove yourself situation. Like, we will extend you, but you got to show us first that you can handle it. And he did. And now he's here for the longer term. So he did everything he needed to do to give the Bruins hope that he can fill in as the number one center or number two center, which in my mind, I would call him the number one center now, just because I think he's your your best center currently. And not to take anything away from Charlie Coyle, because obviously Charlie Coyle has played center for almost the majority of his like NHL career. And then you have Zacha, who not fully established there yet, but I still think he fit wise is probably your number one center on your line. So that was a huge get. Eric Hollow was not going to be part of the long-term answer here with the Bruins. Zacha's also younger and plays a more similar center style to Bergeron than Holla did. So he was, and to your point, Brian, he played with both Bergeron and Krejci for a year, and those two guys are people he had already said he was trying to model his game after when he was coming up. So I'm sure that was a huge help for him.
Yeah, he as it pertains to him versus Coyle, I mean, Zacha has the far higher ceiling, in particular offensively. I think that the Holla for Zacha trade, he's younger, as you mentioned, Bridget. He's bigger. I think he's a smoother skater. I think he's a better skater. I think Holla is fast, but he's choppy. Zacha, he can play different. He can play at different tempos. I think he's got smoother hands, better vision. Like, he's just a better player overall. And you're right, it's a massive addition, because this time last year, give or take, we were talking about if Bergeron and Krejci don't come back, like you mentioned, Bridget. It was like, well, now they need a number one and a number two center, and that's not the case right now. I mean, there's a narrative going around that, oh, Bergeron and Krejci have retired. The Bruins are down their number one and number two center from last year. Okay. Technically, people are right. I think that's a lazy narrative, because I think that in reality, the need right now, the Bruins are a center short, not two. I don't think that, like, having Krejci on the Bruins last year, this year, going forward, like, it was a luxury. It wasn't really a necessity for them to be like, he's not like Zacha could be a number two center if Bergeron was here. So if Bergeron stayed and Krejci retired, the Bruins wouldn't be missing Zacha and or Krejci, I'm sorry, from a positional need. So yes, having Zacha, you're down a center, not two. So you're right. It's a big addition, and he's here with term. So going over the next couple of years here, you just got to find that number one guy, and maybe it is Zacha, but you got to find a number two guy if that's the case. You know, it's just they're a top two center short. That's for sure. Will they make a move before the regular season goes to get an upgrade? We've talked about this at nauseum. We just don't think it's out there. If it happens, it's going to have to be through creativity and just ways we don't see it. But I think Zacha and Coyle are the two guys going into the season. But next year, like, they'll definitely be buyers in the offseason and in free agency. If somebody becomes available, the Bruins will be all over it. But you're going to have to get into bidding wars and hope that they choose you. But in any event, yes, Zacha here solves the problem of needing only one center, not two, for sure.
Yeah, and if Zacha builds off what he did last year, then he's going to be an underpaid top two center. He's going to be very good value at $4.75 million. Like, normally, number one center, you're talking about $9+ million. Number two center, you're usually talking, I don't know, $6 to $8 million in today's NHL. So, yeah, I mean, if he does grow into that and really establishes himself as, if not your true number one center, then, like we said, at least a solid second center, or someone you're just comfortable with on one of your top two lines, then he's also a really good value there, and that helps with your cap situation going forward, and helps when, like you said, Brian, like, there's going to have to be a bidding war to find a true number one center, if that's what they're trying to do, whether it's now, trade deadline, next summer, all of the above. I think Sweeney's now going to kind of constantly be on that search and exploring any and all options. Their cap situation was awful this year, but it will be better next year. And having Zacha on a very reasonable contract helps. So there's that too.
Yeah, and by the way, we were talking about them not having the younger guys that they've drafted coming up, but Zacha was a number 6 overall pick. So you missed on him the first time around. You obviously, they weren't picking that high. So they weren't going to get a center like him in the draft that year. But they found a way to get him eventually later. And it worked out as like a change of scenery kind of move for both Zacha and Haula, and both of them not fitting necessarily in the organizations they were with. So you luck out that this number 6 overall center ends up with you anyway a few years later after the draft, and still young. I think when he came over he was 25. He's 26 now, I believe, Zacha. So you end up not having to worry about the fact that maybe in that few drafts you weren't able to find the solution because you get the guy a little bit later. And then the only real other center we've seen
in that draft specifically, I mean, they could have gotten a top 2 center.
Yeah, they could have.
That was 2015 when they did not draft Matthew Barzal.
Yes, but once again, Zacha was a higher pick than Barzal that they wouldn't have been able to get even with that pick. But either way, they made up for it, right, Brian, for that at least years down the road. And then the other center prospect recently that we haven't seen many of their younger guys get a crack at it because they've had such a deep professional roster of NHL caliber guys that had pretty much solidified their positions. Was the failed Jack Studnicka experiment was one of the only other times. And Frederick at a time was brought up and playing center, and then they moved away from that and moved him to wing. But really, there haven't been many of the prospects that they have drafted that have gotten a real fair chance at even a 4th line center role, because they're bringing in, even for 4th line centers, they're bringing in a Curtis Lazar, they're bringing in a Tomas Nosek, they're bringing in those lower contract 4th line centers that are more established and play this super defensive way. And rather than trying to make this more skilled younger center fit in that 4th line role.
Yeah, and I think we shouldn't just discount, and not that we are, but I was just thinking out loud here. Morgan Geekie is a guy that I'm curious. I'm very curious about him. I mentioned it on the last episode. For a player, I'm just really interested to see how this season plays out for him, along with Zacha. But I mean, could he just what's his ceiling? Do we know? Could he be an elite number 3 center, fringe number 2 center in the future? Is there a lot more to get?
It could be a kind of change of scenery kind of move that gets him spurred as well, the same way we were just talking about Zacha last season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, opportunity is sometimes what players need, and he has size. He has a great release, shot first mentality, and I think skating is what he needs to improve on from what he says about himself and others. But what's his ceiling? What's the ceiling of Jesper Boqvist? Again, to your point, Bridget, in a new environment with different opportunity. Are any of those guys number 1 centers? No. But it's just it's worth following. And do you guys feel because right now, in my opinion, in net, Bruins are as good as any right now in the league, as far as a tandem goes. On the blue line, the Bruins are as good as any in the league, I would say right now. Just about anybody else, I would say. Up front, we've talked about it. They're down a center, a top 2 center, and they're down a top 6 wing. Do you feel like there's any chance that either Lysell or Merkulov, and I know Merkulov is a centerman, but as we've seen before, sometimes the transition to the NHL is on the wing just to get your feet wet. He's a left shot. Lysell's a right shot. We know DeBrusk can play both sides, so there's flexibility there. I think I'm not going to ask you guys to predict the future, but I think that's a fun storyline to follow too. Can one of those two maybe crack their way into a middle 6 winger role this year? Because I really don't think the Bruins, we know they don't have a ton of money. And if they can make a deal and pay for forward, it's going to be up the middle, right? At some point, probably not in the wing. That's a situation where they're going to try to maybe find that internally. Because I don't know if they really love the idea of JVR being their top goal scoring winger besides after Pasternak or DeBrusk. So that's an interesting storyline to follow. Do you guys feel like there's a ceiling there for either of those two?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunity. You mentioned they're likely down a top 6 winger, and that's because we think JVR at this point is ideally a 3rd liner. Even if he's in the top 6, there's a huge opening on the 3rd line. You pencil Frederick and Geeky into 2 spots, one of them center, one wing, and you think those guys are probably third liners. The third player on that line is wide open. Like it could be Boquist, it could be Jacob Lauka moving up, or it could be any of these young guys making a push. And I think you put Merkulov and Lysell at sort of the front of that line just because, one, they've already played a professional season. They're, they have the most upside. They're highly ranked in their prospect system. So yeah, you hope to see those guys make a push, and whether they ultimately win a spot or not, we'll have plenty of time to break that down as camp preseason goes on. But at the very least, yeah, I think you want to see those guys have good camp, play well their first preseason game or 2 or 3 or whatever, and really make it a conversation and make it interesting and force Jim Montgomery and Don Sweeney to think about keeping them. Like that whether they end up getting the spot or not, like that would be good if they're just making that push. Because then even if they don't win an opening night roster spot, at least they're close, and they go down to Providence, they do a little more developing, and you think, hey, you know what? If we need some help come November, December, those guys are ready. We already saw that they were close. It would be, now on the flip side, it's not the end of the world if they're not ready. Like those guys do still have some developing to do, but it would be like a little disappointing if they're not, if it looks like they're not close. Like if we get into camp and preseason and it's like, Boquist and Lauko are kind of, clearly outperforming Merkulov and Lysell, and it's not that much of a competition. That'd be kind of disappointing. Like I want to see like a real push from Lysell and Merkulov.
Yeah, and those are thinking about this kind of topic is what makes me excited and look forward to hockey season this year, and even look forward to preseason because we're weird like that, and we like preseason, and we like to analyze every little bit of who should move where and where can this person fit and are they ready to come up. And I'm excited to see how Lysell and Merkulov do in preseason. We do have to remember Lysell is coming back from a concussion. He is cleared to play now, but in terms of getting a full off season to work out and do things, he had to take a bit of time off because of the injury he suffered at the end of last season. So he hopefully has enough time here through, and he started coming back mid-July, right? So he's had all of August to work towards things and try to get himself on track for this next season. I also think when you mentioned Brian Zacha being able to learn under Bergeron and Krejci for a year, it would be, I'm sure it would help a lot for Lysell to play with and learn from somebody like David Pastrnak. The sooner the better with that kind of thing. So the quicker you get wingers up to talk to, the Brad Marchands and David Pastrnaks, who are professionals that have been on the team for a long time, could help with their development as well, if it makes sense. And if they are determined to have beat out some of the more established guys, or even just guys that have like Lauko, who I wouldn't call him super established, but more established than someone who hasn't played.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to, that's a good point, Bridget. And I think that Merkulov can also learn from Pastrnak in particular. He has a lethal shot, and you watch him down in Providence last year on their power play. They like to use Merkulov a lot, like Boston does with Pastrnak sitting at the circle. They just play opposite circles because Merkulov is a lefty, so he's at the right hash, and Pastrnak is at the left for the one-timer. So like in regards to perfecting the one-timer and just, movement without the puck on the power play, that's something Merkulov can learn from Pastrnak too. But yeah, it's definitely, look, the doom and gloom cloud that has been over last season's end, for me, is completely gone. And it's because like you can't, only one team wins the Stanley Cup every year. And so if you go into a season with cup aspirations or not, one team wins, you'll either be disappointed. But I think there's a lot of excitement here for Boston just to watch the development of players. And I do think they're going to be competitive, as we've talked about. You're a top 6 winger and a top 6 center short, fine. But everywhere else, the team is pretty complete. And a lot of teams that have number 1 and number 2 centers can't say that for their team. So what the Bruins lack versus other teams, the Bruins have over other teams. That's why it's gonna be a very competitive season for, I think, in the NHL. And yeah, I think, Scott, to your point, like, I would be disappointed if they're not pushing, because Merkelov is 22 and Lysel's 20. And we talked about Wyatt Johnson in Dallas, like kids. I mean, Tyler Seguin was on the, I know he's number 2 pick, I get it. Different time and era, I get it, but he was 18 years old when he was a rookie with the Bruins, and yeah, he was a healthy scratch and whatnot. But my point is, players come into the NHL at 18, so to expect a 20-year-old to push is completely fair, and certainly for a 22-year-old in Merkelov. So there are a lot of fun storylines to watch this year as far as development, chemistry. You have a lot of new pieces on this team, and it was a very close locker room last year. New leaders are gonna have to step up. I mean, you've lost a lot of locker room presence and a lot of on ice presence, and to me that creates storylines and excitement. So, yeah, it's around the corner. I know, Scott, you wanted to discuss a little bit about Krejci's legacy in Boston and what that means. So before we get there,
Can I say one more thing about Merkelov? Just that his situation is also an interesting. He's an interesting piece in the organization because he was not drafted, so he was brought in as a free agent. So we're talking about maybe not hitting on the draft picks, but evaluating talent and bringing that in from elsewhere, whether it be signing an undrafted college player and getting them into your system, or trading for someone, but making up for what maybe had been missed or not timed correctly in terms of drafting a center.
Yeah. And Torrey Krug is an example of that too. So yeah, I want to throw it back to you guys. And that was a while ago, but the Bruins are good at identifying NCAA prospects. And so I wanted to throw it back to you guys before we talk about Krejci and his legacy. Just any lingering final thoughts on what we've been discussing?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, with Krejci, I think one of the topics that kind of came up, and I tweeted about it a little bit yesterday, is his number going to be retired? And then sort of secondary to that, how many numbers from this era are going to be retired? I think we can all agree that 33 for Chara and 37 for Bergeron are obvious. To me, Krejci is also a pretty obvious yes, but there was a little more pushback than I kind of anticipated. Not that it was like overwhelming or anything. I think the vast majority of Bruins fans probably think 46 should be retired, and 63 will be retired from Marchand when that time comes as well. But I'm just curious what you guys think. Like, is there any hesitation, or is it clear for you? Like, of course, Krejci's going to the rafters.
I think he needs to go in the rafters. I think he's misunderstood in terms of different parts of his career. I'll get into why he should. It has a lot to do with it. He's among the top 5 to 10 Bruins in most categories, including the important stuff, which has to do with playoffs and game 7s, and the way he's contributed in the postseason, and everything from the number of games he's played to the number of points he had to when he did it, how he did it. And I've always thought he was underappreciated, and I, for years, have been arguing with people I know and who I don't know about that say, oh, Krejci, we don't trade Krejci or find a younger center, whatever. I just don't think people understand his style necessarily, and how he had kind of just had this, I would say, vision, like eyes on the back of his head, that I'd watch him from when he first started to now and go, I have no idea how he knew that guy was there. I have no idea how he found that seam, how, first of all, he knew where everybody was, and second of all, how he was able to do it in the second place. So he has, if you're a casual hockey fan, some of the nuances of the way he plays and what makes him so good kind of tended to be lost on people. And his skill set a lot of it was mental. And he was never flashy, and he's a quiet person in general. Out in the real world, he's quiet, doesn't like to talk, definitely doesn't like to talk about himself. So he's kind of one of those under the radar players who has put up all of these stats, but never got necessarily the accolades he maybe should have. And I think he's good enough to have his number retired in Boston.
Yeah, he's not a hockey Hall of Famer, but he's without a doubt a Boston Bruins Hall of Famer. Bridget, you mentioned he's top 10 in a lot of franchise records. I know he's towards the top in playoff points, playoff games played, led the league in scoring in 2011 and 2013 in the postseason. As I mentioned, he first and foremost, he's a champion, right? And there's only so many Bruins in the team's history that can say that. And I just think that he stepped up big time. I mean, you think about how quickly he developed, right? I mean, his first year in the NHL, he may have had his NHL debut in the 06-07 season, maybe. Like maybe they called him up for a game, but I'd have to check. But by all accounts,
he played 6 games that year, 06-07.
He did, okay. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. But doesn't qualify him as a rookie though, right? His rookie year was the following season. And even that year, he probably played in the 70s, maybe? Does it say, Scott?
56.
56 games in 06, in 07-08. So he went from playing 56 games in 07-08, and remember that was when Bergeron went down in the first week of the season, and that's when Mark Savard was your number one center with Lucic and Kessel on that first line. So he went from playing 56 games that year, had a lot of chemistry with Marco Sturm, to 3 years later being a first-line center for a cup-winning team. And as I mentioned earlier, that was the year where Mark Savard, he went down. He had the concussion from Matt Cook the year prior. David Krejci assumed the number one center position, and they won a Stanley Cup. And, the Bruins, it says a lot, right? Because the Bruins, the year before, David Krejci goes down in the Philadelphia series in Game 4, and the Bruins end up losing the next 4 games and losing the series and their season ends. So it shows you how important Krejci was to that team's success. And then the following year, you don't have Mark Savard, but you win a Stanley Cup. And that's not to discredit Mark Savard at all. I'm just saying, like, Krejci's absence was too much to overcome, and that was only his second or third season in the league. So his role in Boston Bruins history is that of a guy who's top 10 in a lot of categories, and he's a first line center on a championship team. And what's even more impressive is his offensive numbers. Because if you look at his numbers, like he had 73 points a couple times around there. Yeah, he was never a guy in any given year where you were like, yeah, he's like a top 20 or 30 forward in the league. He was never a point per game guy in the league. So league wide, he just never got the recognition you mentioned, Bridget. But he also never had a stretch of time outside of 2010 to 2013, like where he had Horton and Lucic for the majority of that. He always had a Rolodex of wingers. Bergeron had like 6 years with Krejci, with Pastrnak on his wing with Marchand. Krejci never really had that. He always had to make do with what he had, and I think that he oftentimes had to play second fiddle, especially like between like 2014 to 2023 to Bergeron, and you just wonder what he could have put up offensively if he had more of a Pastrnak presence, a lot more, or something like that, like a true sniper or a true goal scorer with them. He never really had that for the majority of his career. So his offensive numbers may have suffered because of that, but definitely a Bruins Hall of Famer. And yes, his numbers should go up in the rafters as well.
Yeah, you mentioned that quick development curve, and really, like, even just in 1 year, from 07-08 to 08-09, 07-08, he has 27 points in those 56 games. Less than half a point a game. 08-09, 73 points in 82 games, and led the NHL in plus 37.
As a third liner that year. with
Yeah,
Wheeler and Ryder.
sort of. We've talked about this before. Like, I do think like at times that line was really, no matter where it was listed, was the second line. Bergeron was coming back from the concussion, suffered another concussion. Certainly offensively had a down year by his standards. But yeah, I mean, that was a huge jump. And that's 73 points. That stood as his career high until he matched it 10 years later in 2018-19. And I feel like that 2018-19 season is maybe his most impressive. So I was looking this up before, and because I remember like writing about this at the time, but it's crazy what he did with the revolving door of wingers he had that year. 18-19, David Krejci finished 6th in the NHL in assists per 60 minutes at 5-on-5. The 5 players in front of him were Nikita Kucherov, Mitch Marner, Evgeny Kuznetsov, Sidney Crosby, and Artemi Panarin. Right behind him was Evgeny Malkin and Connor McDavid. And he played at least 10 minutes of 5-on-5 with 18 different wingers that year. 18. Like, it's insane. You guys want this list? You want to hear some of these fun names?
Yeah, go for it.
Scott, can you say that again? He played what with 18 different what?
10 minutes or more.
At least 10 minutes of 5-on-5 action. By comparison, Patrice Bergeron played with 7 that year. Krejci this last year played with 8. So we're talking like more than double the number of wingers as what would be normal, I guess. But yeah, in order of how much ice time he played with them, Jake DeBrusk, David Pastrnak, had some time, but it was still only like, even with Pastrnak, it was 300 out of nearly 1,200 minutes. Danton Heinen, Joakim Nordstrom, Brad Marchand, and that's because Bergeron missed some time that season. Peter Cehlarik, I am amazed. He played 166 minutes with Peter Cehlarik. I did not even remember that Peter Cehlarik spent that much time in the NHL that season. Like, that's insane. David Backes, Carson Kuhlman, Charlie Coyle bumped over to the wing at times. Ryan Donato, Marcus Johansson, Chris Wagner, Anders Bjork, Sean Corrali, Jacob Forsbacher-Carlson, Paul Carey, Lee Stempniak, and Nola Chari.
What?
There's a lot of names there that, whatever happened to JFK, I don't think he ever came back and played in the NHL after that. Forsbacher-Carlson I'm talking about, but wow.
That was one season?
Yeah.
Yeah, 1 year.
Did you say 18-19 or 17-18?
18-19.
Lee Stempniak was on the team in 18-19?
Yep. He played.
What?
I know, right?
I thought that was like the 2 years prior, but when they missed the playoffs, he was on the team at the deadline. I'm confused. Regardless,
Stempniak played 2 games that season. I think, if I remember correctly, I think that was like a situation where they brought him in like on a tryout and he practiced with them a little bit, and then there must have been an injury situation, but he came in, played a couple games, apparently on a line with David Krejci. So
the Peter Cehlarik numbers is that counting or discounting like mini hockey in the hotel on road trips? Because I don't think they played 166 minutes together. But whatever happened to that guy, he was
5 mini hockey though, Brian. It was 5-on-5.
Yeah, Peter Cehlarik played 20 games that season
in the banquet hall downstairs next to the continental breakfast. He wasn't bad for a couple of games. He just kind of like I just don't think he had the speed at the NHL level, I guess, because he was okay at times. But yeah, that just illustrates the point. Like Krejci, just like he was just constantly trying to make chicken soup out of chicken shit, right? And for a lot of his career, and like even the Horton Lucic connection, like the like when Savard was healthy. Savard was between Lucic and Horton that 2010-11 season. When he went down for good, then Krejci assumed that line. And then, 2012, 2013, you had a half season because of the lockout. So even the time where he had set line mates for like 3 years, it was kind of like dependent on a lockout and was Savard healthy and whatnot. And then he had a Ginla for Horton in 13-14. And then after that, it was just, I mean, Scott just mentioned 18 guys in one season. Krejci must, I mean, the list is, I mean, from like from 2015 to 2017-18, the list was so random. I mean, you had the Seth Griffiths of the world, you had the Matt Boleskis. I'm sure Jimmy Hayes got a crack with Krejci at one point. I mean, Ryan Spooner, Frank Vetrano,
Frankie V.
yeah, it just so yeah, and he still had a franchise Hall of Fame career. With all that said, so to me, he's a no-brainer. He'll be missed, but definitely, same thing with Bergeron. Like, just been an absolute pleasure to watch him. I think with Krejci, he missed last year by going back to Czechia, so we're a little bit more ready for this one, I guess. But yeah, Bridget, you mentioned end of an era. Even though Lucic's coming back makes us want to continue the era for one more year, but it is the end of an era. I mean, Martian is the last one remaining. Lucic comes back for a flash in the pan, but it's time for the kids to take over now, and it's going to be fun to watch. Hopefully they can succeed.
And one other thing I was going to mention, Krejci too, is stepping up in the playoffs right up till the end, literally till the end, even as banged up as he was this past postseason, missing a couple of games in that series. Game 7, Bruins are down 2-0. Krejci scores. Krejci assists on Bertuzzi's goal to tie the game. Krejci assists on Pasternak's goal to put them ahead in the third period. Goes out with a goal and 2 assists in Game 7, and we all feel like that was a third period lead they should have hung on to, and obviously they didn't, and they end up losing in overtime. But had they held on, that's like yet another page in the playoff Krejci story that unfortunately gets largely forgotten now. But the story, if banged up Krejci comes back and has 3 points in Game 7 to lead a comeback win, like that, we were less than a minute from that happening.
Yeah, in terms of the like playoff stats that you mentioned, I saw NHL PR has an Instagram. They put up a few of the like standout stats from Krejci's career, and one of them was in 12 career Game 7s, he has 1 goal and 12 assists for 13 points. That's incredible. He has more than a point per game in Game 7s, and he's the only player in NHL history besides Justin Williams to have 13 or more points in Game 7s. And some of the stats I was mentioning earlier as well, that he finished in the top 10 all-time Bruins list, was 5th in most games, 5th in assists, 9th in points, and tied for 6th in overtime goals. So you're talking about, it's not really a surprise about the assists. He's always been a really great setup guy. But also overtime goals, that's talking about him being clutch in situations where you needed him to be, just like we were mentioning in the playoffs.
Absolutely. And, we were just talking about the Rolodex of wingers that he had throughout his career. And, that was even evident early on. And you talk about one thing that you just appreciate from him was his ability to do whatever was asked of him, play with whoever he was asked to play with. And I'm sure there were times where he wanted to be playing with the top wingers on the team, and sometimes those guys went to Bergeron. But you think back to 2011, and not only were the Bruins down Mark Savard as their number 1 center, so Krejci already assumed that role, and you go into the finals and you go down 2-0 to Vancouver. You start Game 3, it's already an uphill climb. You go down Nathan Horton. So as the Bruins' number 1 center, he on the fly had to adjust to now Rich Peverley being on his wing. And a ton of credit goes to Lucic and a ton of credit goes to Peverley for stepping up. But David Krejci showed even back then the ability to just on the fly work with whatever he was given and make it work. And that trio was great. I mean, like Lucic, Peverley, and Krejci, they did what they had to do. Especially they were big in game. They were really big in game 4, getting the Bruins going. And it just worked. And so he just was he was like water. He just, whatever was asked of him, whatever situation, he just kind of went with the flow and excelled. I have a favorite David Krejci memory. And I'm sure maybe you guys share this. So if it's the same memory, maybe you can just talk to the listeners about, your memory of this play. And if you have a different memory, feel free to share that as well. And maybe it's a memory from being in the locker room. But I remember clear as day watching Game 7 versus Tampa Bay and the ultimate go-ahead goal. And I just remember game-winning goal. That entire game, it was like you just knew watching it that whoever scored, the later the game went, even if it was the second period, like you just knew. But the later the game went, you knew whoever got that first goal was going to win the game. And when Krejci scored in overtime, the third period on the pass from or Horton scores on the pass from Krejci, it was just like you were like, wow, I think the Bruins are going to go to the Cup Finals here. Like, this is crazy. And of course, the last 7 minutes was like agony getting there. But the saucer pass to Nathan Horton on the right post backdoor to give the Bruins the 1-0 lead in Game 7 against Tampa was just, that's going to be my number one David Krejci memory. And I remember watching it in my house, and I remember where I was and what I was thinking and the butterflies I had, and I was like, fuck these. So part of my language, I try not to swear too much on this, but I was like, this is they're going to the Cup Finals, and that's my favorite Krejci memory. So I don't know if you guys share that memory or if there's a different one as well.
Yeah, that's number one for me for sure. And I was there. I was an intern at WEI at the time, but I was covering all the Bruins home games.
Scott, you old.
That's right, with DJ Bean and Mike Petralia at the time, and where they had, like, the way they set up the press box for playoffs back then, it used to wrap all the ways around. There were so many seats it would wrap all the ways around. So this was in the rafters or whatever they call those seats up there now. Like, they didn't put fans up there for the playoffs. And I happened to be right behind the Bruins goal, looking down ice at that play developing into the Tampa zone. So, starts with great patient breakout pass from Andrew Ference. And then it just like perfectly encapsulates everything about Krejci, the way he sets it up, where it's, he's not moving at top speed. He kind of just glides into the offensive zone, finds the open space, pulls up, waits for Horton to put his stick down, and perfect pass for the tap in. And it's just like, I think that breakout in part is a set play to combat that 1-3-1 neutral zone trap that Tampa, famously had under Guy Boucher at that time. But Krejci's part of it is improvisation as much as anything. It's just he sees a little bit of open space, he skates into it and takes a look around, and Horton's obviously going to the net like he's supposed to be on that play, and Krejci just waits for it to open up and makes the pass. And it's like, yeah, it was just kind of like the perfect patience and playmaking that we saw from him so often. And obviously that there were so many big goals during that run that you could pick out, but that's very close to, if not at the top of the list.
Yeah, I remember where I was for that too. I was actually watching the game up in New Hampshire. And I was watching it with some of my family members. And that is one of the most memorable games in general, which is funny because it only had the one goal. But it felt like the whole time you knew from the beginning, like you said, Brian, it was just going to be a 1-goal game. That was the only one that was coming. So whoever got it, and that, even though it's not your high scoring game, it was still one of the most dramatic games and so huge for that season. So I do remember that play, and I'm not sure. I would have to say that probably is mine as well. But he's had so many good playoff performances. I enjoyed, and this isn't a specific play, but I really enjoyed the time that we got to watch him play with Hall and Pasternak as a line. There were some stretches where they were very entertaining to watch. And those are three guys that you're like, I don't know how we ever ended up getting to see these three guys on the same line, because, I mean, wouldn't have thought Taylor Hall was necessarily going to be a Bruin. But once you did see it, you're like, oh, I need to see more of this. And then when Krejci left for a season, I was like, well, darn, I wanted to watch more of that line. I wouldn't really get that much of it this year. But in general, he has more of like it's more what the way I remember him and think about him is just how he meshed and how he played with other players and made them look better. He made them look better. And also that he's so like the stereotypical like Boston Bruin mold is like a gritty, tough guy. And Krejci was the opposite of that, but he was perfect for the team and kind of like a calming, steadying presence is probably why he's had so much success with so many different line mates.
You know, now that I think about it, as time goes on, you know, with this, Bridget, as you've mentioned, is kind of the end of an era officially. And so you think back on the memories and also kind of, you know, it's easy to look at how the Bruins, in my opinion, in the opinion of many, I'm sure the players included, they at least left one cup on the table, but they had a crack at a couple more. But it makes you realize, like, look, at least they got the one, because you just realize how hard it is. I mean, it took, you know, it's very difficult, and so you really appreciate that 2011 team. And I feel like a lot of people look back at the Montreal series because it's Montreal, the Philly series because it was revenge on Philly from the year before, and the Vancouver series because how much hatred grew in that series alone, and how it was the classic East versus West, Canadian city versus American city. It was a perfect Stanley Cup final. But dare I say that Tampa Bay team that year, getting through them, like, I mean, that was a incredible series. And looking back now in retrospect, they may have been top to bottom the best team the Bruins faced, because that Vancouver team, yeah, you had Ryan Kessler and the Sedins in their heyday, but I don't know. Tampa Bay had a young Steven Stamkos who had already established himself as a 60-goal scorer, I think, in the league. You had a young Victor Hedman. You had Marty St. Louis and LeCavalier who could still play. Dwayne Rolison was lights out, far better than Luongo was in their respective series against Boston. And there's a good supporting cast too. Like Ryan Malone was on Tampa. He was a good, effective player back then. Teddy Purcell was good back then. Simone Gagne, who was a Bruins killer, was on that team. You had guys that were feisty, like Steve Downey and Nate Thompson, and they were just. Eric Brewer was a good, solid defenseman. That Tampa Bay team, that Bruins team beating them in that series, I feel like is underrated. Not Game 7. Game 7 people talk about, and it was an unbelievable game, no penalties. But that Tampa Bay team may have been the best team the Bruins had to play, top roster-wise, in hindsight. Like at the time, I didn't realize how good Victor Hedman was back then. Now he's like one of the best defensemen in the world, has been for 10 years. So it's like, they were a great blend of youth in Stamkos and Hedman, and then experience with St. Louis and LeCavalier and Rolson, guys that have been there and done it before. And that Bruins team getting through that Tampa Bay team, I think, is underrated. It was a great feat, and David Krejci had a hat trick in Game 6. The Bruins lost that game, but he had a hat trick in Game 6, and his fingerprints were all over Game 7. And so, yeah, Krejci was, you know, can't say enough good things about him as a player and a Bruin, but that Tampa Bay series, looking back, that team was really, really formidable.
Yeah, and just the swings that series took, that like not just from like one team winning to the other, but from high scoring to low scoring, like it was all over the place. And it was like every game felt unpredictable. Like Tampa scored 5 goals 4 times in that series. Like that's crazy. It's crazy to do that and win a series. You know, Tim Thomas had some excellent games and had some pretty rough games in that series. You know, same with Rolison on the other side. Like that game 2, the Bruins already down 1-0, and then it's a 6-5 win, and you get that 4 points from Tyler Seguin in the second period, and he's only in there because Bergeron's dealing with the concussion and Seguin had to come in. Like, yeah, it was a wild series, really start to finish. And then like it seemed like in the middle of the series, maybe they were figuring each other out. And then even Game 6, you get a 5-4 game. And then of course the legendary 1-0 Game 7. Like it was, yeah, that was one of the, you know, more fun series. And none of the games went to overtime, which is crazy. Like it's extremely memorable, and you didn't even have any overtime heroics, but just yeah, it was a very competitive series, and one that, you know, it seemed like both teams kind of kept figuring different things out about each other, and then having to solve and adjust and try different things, and it all kind of culminated in that game 7 that was, you know, sort of like the perfect hockey game, like no penalties, and there were a lot of shots in that game if I remember correctly. I was just gonna pull up the box score, but I think like both teams were over 30 shots on goal, or, you know, something like that. Like it, you know, like there were chances. It wasn't like it was just like a boring, dull game.
No, it was a goalie game though. Like that's why you knew it was only going to be one goal. Like would probably decide it, because it was like nobody can crack either of these goalies right now.
But
And
it was,
in the final against Vancouver, everybody was on serve at that point, and Vancouver was the home team for game 7. So it was like, okay, every single game the home team's won. You now have to go win game 7 on the road in Vancouver where you haven't won yet. And I remember that I think I was in school that day. I was in high school because I'm young, Scott. I was in high school.
I was in school, or actually, I had technically graduated by then.
Cool.
I graduated that spring from college.
Yeah, so I was in high school. It was my letter night, like to get my varsity jacket letter night. I couldn't have given 2 craps about that. My parents were so mad at me. I wouldn't take pictures. I grabbed the jacket, didn't wait for the ceremony to finish, and went home so that I could get ready for game 7 because I didn't want to miss it. I was such a pain in the ass that day. My family's still mad at me about it, but I was like, I have to go. I couldn't think about anything else the whole day. So I was like, thank you, grabbed my varsity jacket, peaced out. And I was really glad that it wasn't a 1-0 final for game 7 of the Stanley Cup though. That game was actually enjoyable for Bruins fans because there wasn't a lot of back and forth, like there were lead changes and things like that. It was actually an enjoyable game 7.
Yeah, it really was. And, you know, one final thought for me is, and this comes to my mind because it's not just Krejci retiring, as Bridget, you mentioned it. It's kind of, we're billing it as like, it's like the end of an era type thing, right? And don't get me wrong, a Stanley Cup championship is a Stanley Cup championship. But one thing I really appreciate about that 2011 run is that it was everything you could possibly ask for in a Stanley Cup run. Like Tampa Bay, you know, it wasn't like Tampa Bay winning a Stanley Cup in a bubble, or the following year winning it where the Bell Center is empty and Tampa has fans. It wasn't like the Kings in 2012 where they just walked through everybody and there wasn't like a ton of like suspense there. It wasn't even like Vegas this past year where they weren't really challenged much, right? Like they go down to Montreal 2-0. One of the greatest rivalries in sports. You have to go into Montreal, tie the series. They do so in overtime. Game 5 double OT, game 7 OT, and then the following series you sweep Philly. You do what you couldn't do the year before, one of the most embarrassing losses in league history, Bruins history for sure, and you put yourself in the same exact situation, up 3. But this time you finished the job. Home ice was reversed. Tampa Bay, outstanding 7-game series. Vancouver, you go down again, 2-0. The hatred that boiled, and you win game 7 for the Stanley Cup. Like that run wasn't just a Stanley Cup run. And I'm not looking at this through Boston Bruins glasses. Like that was an incredibly played like playoff run. There was drama, there was hatred, there was suspense, there was true moments of thinking the season was done only to realize it wasn't. And you just don't get that every year with a Stanley Cup champion. Oftentimes it's just, you just don't. So I really respect that. And they didn't make it easy on themselves, but it really made for a memorable championship. And so again, like end of an era, but that was just really special to watch, you know?
Well, and while we're on 2011, I wasn't there for this, but one of my favorite stories that it's been told by other reporters, specifically Steve Conroy, DJ Beam, who was covering them for EI at the time, and Joe McDonald. I think they've all told this story. And the Bruins during the Montreal series in the first round actually stayed in Lake Placid in upstate New York because there's like a long gap between games. There's like 3 days off or something. And I think it was between games 3 and 4. And DJ, Steve, and Joe were like all in a bar, and a bunch of the Bruins ended up at the same bar, restaurant, whatever. And they said that like there was like a karaoke machine there, and people put on different songs and whatever. And Krejci went over and put on Journey's "Don't Stop Believin'," and because the Bruins were still trailing in the series at that time. And I guess like when they asked him about it after, he like totally denied that there was any meaning to it. But it's just like it's funny. Like it's one of those funny Krejci moments where we hear that all the time, and we see it sometimes in the media that he can be funny, but then like he won't even take credit for it. He won't even because like they were all the way they tell is like they'll be like, well, we have our lead if they win the Stanley Cup. Like they were trailing Montreal, and Krejci put on "Don't Stop Believin'," and like he refused to even like acknowledge that it had happened or that it was intentional or anything.
Well, yeah, he didn't like to confirm much to us. He mentioned it in his statement that the Bruins put up, and also kind of joked about it in his press conference today. Like, I know you guys, like, I know, I don't like to talk much, but
yeah, and that's another big thing. Like going forward, it's not just the on ice presence; it's the off ice presence. This locker room they're gonna miss Bergeron's leadership and calmness, and in the exit interviews, like the players like they did with Bergeron, they had a little video wishing Krejci farewell and whatnot, and they all talk about like how funny he is, and so there's an on ice difference next year for this team to overcome, and there's a locker room difference. There's a change in. I mean, half the team is gone. Half the locker room is gone from the postseason. So it really does come down to Bergeron, Marchand, and Pasternak and McAvoy. And I do think that's a big reason why Lucic is back, right? Like to kind of remind this younger generation of like what it means to be a Bruin, because Lucic, he hasn't been here for 8 years, but he knows what it means to be a Bruin. And I think that he's here to help Marchand in a leadership role in the locker room. And but in any event, a lot to look forward to, a lot of change. Change is exciting. There's going to be a lot. There's going to be no shortage of things to write about for you, Scott, and Bridget, you as well, when you're not producing Red Sox games. So, or maybe while you're producing Red Sox games.
don't tell them about my multitasking skills.
So, in any event, yeah, David Krejci retires from the NHL. I don't know if you guys mentioned it, but he mentioned that he's not coming back to the NHL. He might return after January to play overseas in Czechia for the World Championships, but that's about it, if he even does that. So he's no longer a Bruin. He's done, and it's time for the Bruins to welcome in this new era, and it's going to be a transition, but we'll be here for it. Congrats to Krejci on the career. Bridget and Scott, any final comments before we wrap this one up?
No, just that I really enjoyed watching Krejci play. I think, Bridget, like you were saying earlier, how maybe some fans maybe didn't totally appreciate the way he played. I mean, to me, he was one of the most fun Bruins to watch play. Like just the way he saw the ice, the passes he made. Like it's, I'm definitely gonna miss watching that, because he was unique. Like in a league that kept getting faster, he continued to slow the game down when the puck was on his stick, and just have the perfect amount of patience, like know how to still protect the puck, even if guys around him are moving faster. And I found that a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah. And not to show my bias completely, but I think I started really caring more about the team once Krejci started his career, because I really enjoyed watching him play. I became more and more invested following him, and then that snowballed into following the team, and then the NHL, and then here we are now. So Krejci, without Krejci being on the Bruins, maybe I'm not even in this business. I don't even know. Like, that's the thing. It's like I was a big Sidney Crosby fan when I first got into hockey, and David Krejci fan, and that has taken me from just being a teenager or in middle school or whatever it was, to now where I'm an NHL reporter and I'm a hockey broadcaster. And so in like a very long-term way, he has definitely impacted my life and even my career decisions. So I guess that's how I'd like to wrap it up.
Well said. I'm glad that he had that impact on you, Bridget, and I'm sure he impacted a lot of hockey fans and hockey players and the way he played and stuff. So, with that said, we're about 5 weeks away from preseason hockey, so we are getting there slowly but surely. And Bridget, Scott, myself will be here the entire time throughout the off season, doing the podcast as always. And that wraps up this episode. So thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you very soon. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave